and welcome to RL-VOA. I'm Emily Thompson from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Communications Department, representing the Lady Liberty Project to promote women in media. And I'll be moderating our discussion today, which is titled Moving the Story Forward, Women in Global Media. And I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists who bring a wealth of expertise on this topic, some as highly successful journalists in their own right and media managers, and some as highly regarded researchers and advocates for women in media. So I'm joined in Prague by Shahida Tulaganova, who is the managing editor, anchor, and producer of Current Time TV, which is a Russian-language daily news program broadcast in countries bordering Russia. She's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, including for the BBC, and her latest film, Airport Donetsk, was recently awarded the first prize in Russia's largest documentary film festival, Art Doc Fest. Welcome. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Elisa Munoz. She's the executive director of the International Women's Media Foundation, which is really the premier U.S.-based international organization empowering women journalists through training, as well as the recognition of their achievements through your prestigious awards. And Elisa has over 20 years of experience in human rights, press freedom, and gender equality issues. Welcome, Elisa.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And in Brussels, we're joined by Carrie Brown. She's the managing editor with POLITICO, overseeing its European newsroom. She previously worked as Politico's White House correspondent and covered Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And for some people who might not be familiar, Politico in the US is really the go-to news site for national politics. And the Europe site, I believe, is only a little over a year old, but it's already becoming a major player in European politics. So welcome, Carrie.
8 months old.
Okay. And in the UK, we're joined by Karen Ross, who's a professor of media at Northumbria University in Newcastle and author of several books on women in media, including most recently Gender Politics News, A Game of Three Sides. And she was also the regional coordinator for the Global Media Monitoring Project's most recent report on the status of women in the media. Welcome, Karen.
Hello, good to be here.
Great, and just a reminder for our viewers on YouTube, you can tweet us your questions or comments using the hashtag RFE, and I'll put them to the panel. So to get us to this is a huge topic and one that merits much more time than we have right now, but if I could kind of divide it into two sides of the coin, one is who's telling the stories, meaning the profession of media, who's getting the bylines, who's in the editorial management positions, and whose stories are we telling, meaning how are we covering women's issues, so-called women's issues, how are we covering you know, gender issues, who gets visibility in the news. So those are our two sides, and if we start with kind of a data-driven approach, we're lucky that just in November the Global Media Monitoring Project put out its most recent comprehensive report on 114 countries on the status of women in the media. And as Karen, who we have with us in the UK, was an instrumental part of this research, maybe Karen, you could start and just tell us a little bit of background about the Global Media Monitoring Project as well as some key findings from this year.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the Global Media Monitoring Project. So this, the first GMMP started in 1995, and it's been repeated every 5 years. So the last one was in 2015. That was the fifth project. It was started really by the World Association for Christian Communication. They had an idea with Media Watch in Canada in 1994 to do something, to actually start monitoring the way in which women and men appear in news. It's very much focused on news. And over this period, over the 20 years, what's been very disappointing is someone who actually has been looking at this relationship between women and media for at least that amount of time. What's incredibly disappointing is that in 2015, 20 years after the first project happened, what we see in terms of women's visibility, in 1995, women made up 17% of everyone who was seen and heard and listened to in the news. And in 2015, that's gone up by 7%. 7% in 20 years. which is entirely pathetic. And part of our debate today might be, one of the things we might consider is, what's going on then? Given where women are in society, given the number of, I teach journalism at Northumbria. The vast majority of my students are women. That's been the case for years, at least a decade. So something's happening, something happens to women when they leave university and enter professions. And again, GMMP shows that, looks at where women are as presenters, as journalists. And again, we see, in fact, what we see in 2015 is that women in newspapers and radio, the proportion has gone down over the last 5 years. So in some ways, the findings are so kind of contradictory to how we experience our lives. And there's a kind of gap between how we experience our lives as teachers, as educators, as journalists, as women, as politicians, and how that reality is or isn't reflected in the media. I think that's one of the key findings that came out of GMMP 2015 and GMMP 1995. We're seeing the same thing, and we need to kind of think about why that's happening, and maybe kind of talk about why that might be happening, and and more importantly, what we can do to change the picture.
I was also shocked by the findings, especially with regards to Western countries, that we like to think that we're getting better and better every way and every day, but there's stagnation or backpedaling even in some Western countries. I failed to mention earlier, Shahida will actually have to leave our broadcast for a few minutes to go sub in for another TV presenter, but she'll come back to us. So I'd like to put the first question to Shahida. So we've established by the data that women are not as well represented in the profession. What are we missing if we don't have enough women in editorial positions?
We're missing a lot of human stories, I think, because from my experience, and I mainly work in war zones, when we have male reporters, and they like to talk about the fight, they like to talk about the military machines, all this equipment, they like the excitement. They completely miss out, and they're not interested in the stories of these little people who suffer. So you always have to remind them, find me this person, find me the human story. And that's the problem. That's how the picture of war and sufferings is being distorted. Something what we see in coverage of Syria now. We see a lot of explosions. We see the bombing campaign. Do we see a human story of people suffering? We see sporadic videos, because most of the people who are making these videos and videotaping whatever's happening there are men. So I think having women covering this particularly troublesome points is very, very important, because we see it from a different point of view as being as women.
Elisa, would you like to chime in on that as well? What are we failing news consumers if we don't have women in leadership positions making decisions about the stories?
I think that it's pretty well expected that the media represent the society that it serves, and unfortunately that is not what we have found. The IWMF did a global study on the status of women in the news media, and as Karen mentions, things haven't changed much since, but in every nation that we studied, there was a glass ceiling. Depending on where you are in the world, you find the glass ceiling at different parts of the spectrum in terms of positions. There has been no study, no global study on how that impacts content. GMMP is fabulous, and I think what we need, Karen kept asking the question, why is this happening? How is this happening? And I think we really need to do a global study on the impact of women in higher levels of the news media versus what is the content that those media outlets are producing. That study has not been done. I think there's a lot of anecdotal discussion about how the content would change if more women were in leadership positions, but I do think it's really important to know for sure and to do a statistically valid study about how that content is impacted by having more women in the news media. I think that would be tremendously helpful for media organizations to know, so that they can better serve their constituencies. And I do think that if a newsroom doesn't look like the audience that it's serving, we have a problem.
Can I just come in there? I mean, I think it chimes in with something that Shahida's just said, which is, you know, one of the arguments is, that women journalists will often say is that we, you know, not necessarily will do different news stories, but the angles will be different. So you're still going to be covering war, but as a woman, you're likely to cover it in a different way. The human interest, actually talk to the people who are the collateral damage of war, as well as, you know, everything else which is happening. And I think Elisa is right. What media managers say is, well, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence that actually more women in the newsroom makes a difference. And at the moment, we can't show that evidence. And I think that absolutely, those of us who've looked at issues around content and issues of professional practice, those two things are kind of, they're important, but we need to bring them together in order to kind of produce a study where we can enable our colleagues in journalism to actually say, here is the evidence, this is how it makes a difference in content, but more importantly, how the audience react to these different kinds of angles, a different kind of content. Because in the end, what's going to force through change is the bottom line. It's actually going to be about the audience and about figures. So if we can kind of demonstrate not only that there's an impact on the content agenda, but also it means that more women are likely to become news consumers, that would make a difference. We don't have that evidence yet.
Okay, let me bring Carrie into the discussion, because we don't have this evidence to show how content would change if there were more women in editorial leadership positions. But as someone who is in an editorial leadership position, Carrie, do you see more women editors as influencing the news agenda?
I do, and I mean, I think Politico Europe actually is a very unique newsroom in a certain respect. The managing editor, the publisher of Politico Europe, is a woman, longtime businesswoman. I'm managing editor, which is the second highest position in the newsroom. The director of sales here is also a woman. About half of our editors are women, and half of our reporters are women. Another two other high-level senior editors are women. We're a newsroom of about 40 people, and this is not something I think that I was part of the hiring process at the beginning, but we were conscious of gender balance, of course, but we've been even more successful than I think we even did consciously, in a way, and I do think it changes the culture of a newsroom. I'm not quite sure yet how it impacts the content. I would say I'm there as a person. It's almost measured in some ways as what doesn't get out there. I have a certain lens that I put on news and how women are portrayed, and that is subconscious. It's like it's just the way it is, and I can think of a couple examples of portrayals of women in copy that I've seen that I've prevented from seeing the light of day. So in some ways, it's almost you have an impact by what doesn't get seen, more so than what you are putting out there. Because the news. I direct the news coverage here, and so I don't necessarily look at the news report every day as to how a woman would see it, but I do see things slightly different than my male colleagues, and there is a difference, and it does matter, and we are very proud of sort of the women that we have in this newsroom at all levels of very, very senior leadership to rank and file reporters. And I was lucky enough to be supported by male editors and female editors, but having, Politico is often a tough newsroom at the early stages. I've been with Politico since it launched in the U.S. in 2007, and lots of stories have been written about the culture there for women. And I'm not quite sure it was ever an overt gender thing as much as it is the news cycle and being aggressive and trying to be first and break news. It rewards, in some ways, the instincts of male reporters, which is shoot first and ask questions later, or publish first and make sure it's correct later. Whereas I always viewed it as like women like to be right, and they like to be cautious in some ways, and not just throw stuff out there without sort of being fully confident that it's going to be right. And I think sort of the traits of women, without overgeneralization, is that And so a sort of a fast-paced, aggressive environment rewards male reporters, whereas women reporters, generally, check things 3 or 4 times. And so as I started this newsroom, I was very conscious of sort of the culture and making this a place where women reporters can succeed along with the male reporters, of course, but I'm very aware, as a woman, the challenges and not creating a newsroom where all genders, obviously both genders, can succeed. But it is a conscious thing, and having women in leadership positions is better for everybody, I think.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective that I hadn't thought of, that the issue of women's different approach to the craft. I should excuse Shahida real quickly.
I want to tap in too.
No, go ahead.
I totally agree with you, because I have 30 reporters, mainly in Russia and Ukraine, and I have among them, there are only 2 or 3 guys. All of them are girls, and it's not because I specifically select them. It's just because they work harder, they're more disciplined, they do proper research, and they're always there. They really want to work. Yeah. Whereas, the topics they suggest, normally what I would choose is some stories of little Russians from faraway areas of Russia, which nobody covers really, even in Russia proper. But they do, and it's interesting. But this is what people watch. The story about 80-year-old woman who is left somewhere in Ukraine during the war. She doesn't have anything, and the only pet she's got a pigeon. Made huge headlines because this is a story, and that was suggested by a girl. Whereas my guys normally go and film with battalions.
Yeah, there's just an added value.
I'll join you guys here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if I could, for a minute, if I could stick with Carrie. You're someone who was a White House correspondent. You were doing political reporting, which I think, Elisa, you referred earlier to your organization's study, and I believe I remember that there, which I can't bring up right now, but that women's bylines and production credits in what we consider hard news reporting, meaning politics and economics, they're even less common in these fields of reporting. So, Carrie, could you just talk to us a little bit about, the sort of bullpen of high-level politics reporting in DC?
Yeah, I covered the Obama campaign in 2008, and there were a lot of stories, and this was a reality. It was a very sort of clubby boys network around, then Senator Obama at the time. And there was a group of women journalists who covered the campaign. There's a group of about 6 of us. We're all competitors, but we worked for different news organizations, and we have this bond that exists till to this day, where we're all still close. But we would often remark back then that it was sometimes hard to connect with Obama's advisors, because there was this banter that existed with the male reporters and the aides about sports. Not that we couldn't do that, but there was this sort of barrier that existed often with the male journalists and the female journalists and the relationships with the aides. And it was just always sort of an added thing in terms of how you conducted yourself on the campaign trail, where if you wanted to sort of really feel and do the whole, hey, yeah, that game last night, and you sort of, that was always the way in for the male reporters, and that continued into the White House when I covered the White House. And as time went on, as more women came into the White House, there's this, I sort of gravitated towards them as sources too, and there was and as the female reporters covering the White House, we started a group of us who would have dinner with female White House or administration officials, and we sort of had created our opportunities for us, and of course it was a shared, we were having dinners with competitors, so it was more just like a get to know you sort of social thing, but it was also empowering, and in some ways to this day, I sort of forged better relationships with a lot of the high-level women in the White House than I did the men. And that was always something that struck me through my years of covering Washington and covering the White House, where we created our opportunities where they didn't exist before. And now there's stories are being written about the core of reporters who are covering the campaign this year, and they're just massive amounts of women covering the campaigns. And there's the question of whether that's because of Hillary or just because women reporters, there are lots of young, talented women who are coming up through the ranks. And I mean, I saw that there was a large group of women back in 2008 and certainly 2012, and now 2016 there's even more. But there is even though there's a large group of women, I think we all still felt like the need to support each other, because we did feel like there was just a need to do that still, because political reporting, has always been dominated by men. But I really did see that changing in a very significant way over my time in Washington. And I see so many talented women, and I think my newsroom here sort of also suggests that, where there's just, women are, they're like, they're half of journalism school more, so it's only natural that we're starting to see that bubble up, and that's wonderful to see.
That is encouraging. And you mentioned that last note that more than half of journalism students are women. But Karen, you mentioned in your opening when you introduced us to the Global Media Monitoring Project study that we don't see a translation of, and in your work as a professor, you see all of these students, but we don't see that translate, in the pipeline 10 years. After we've seen this increase in students, we don't see that translate into an increase all the time in women in editorial management positions. So Karen, do you get a sense for what happens to your students after they graduate? Are they discouraged? Is there something more daunting about the field for them that they don't advance, or what's your feeling?
I mean, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that they're daunted, and I think the point that Carrie's making is an important one, which is that over time we are seeing in some countries, I mean, North America I think is actually quite different to much of Europe, sadly. I mean, sadly, Europe, I mean, not great for the US. In terms of women's progression, I think about my own students, or in fact students generally, or in fact students or young women and men graduating within kind of European kind of journalism context. What seems to happen is that they enter the profession in more or less similar numbers, women and men, but they don't progress. Women don't progress as far. They often leave the profession in a greater proportion than men. And when they do progress within a newsroom, they often have different beats to men. And again, that was shown up very clearly in the GMMP 2015 findings. So that women journalists, were a much smaller proportion of all journalists, well, a small proportion in relation to men, one thing, but actually where women journalists do appear, they often appear, well, they don't appear so much in what we would consider to be hard news in terms of politics. So what GMMP suggests is that there are fewer women who get the bylines, and in fact all the UK research would also support that if you just look at front page bylines, I think there was a piece of research done in 2012 on UK bylines, and it was something like 30% of bylines on front pages are women. So there's something about, it's not just the pipeline in terms of progression into management positions, but it's also where women and men go. So they don't tend to, as Shahida said, they don't tend to go into the field in terms of war reporting. So there's something about women are encouraged into certain beats. And
throw out a couple of trends that I've seen in media recently. And I'll just open it up to anybody, whoever wants to jump in, if you think these are positive trends or negative trends in terms of promoting women in the media. Special women's sections, special women's pages. The New York Times has their new Women in the World page. It seems like all of the national papers of record and well-known news sites, they introduce these new women's sections. And I'm curious what your view, if these special sections are an opportunity for more stories told by women about women on women's issues, or if we're kind of building a ghetto where we don't aim for above the fold page one in the regular news site, and we're kind of marginalizing these stories.
I think it's two things. I think that they offer brilliant opportunities for women to learn their craft. They offer opportunities for new stories to be told, but there is the danger that there's a ghetto. But that's the case with anything which is women only. You know, women poetry prizes. Actually, unless we do that, women are never going to be experienced enough, or have the confidence perhaps to then compete against men. So I think we've got two things going on there. One is a very positive, for me, is a very positive thing. I will turn to, because I think that I'm going to read something, learn something new that I didn't know. On the other hand, I do feel sad that we still, in 2016, have a society where those pages actually are important when they shouldn't be, because actually all news, all media should reflect society, but it clearly doesn't. And while it doesn't, here's a way to actually at least get something different out there in terms of story and voice.
What do you think, Carrie?
I'm not a fan of the women's page. Something about it feels very old to me. Like it's just it says it's not the way we should be looking at it. I think that having a news report that's inclusive, we often do profiles, or we take a look at key newsmakers, and I'm conscious of whether we're doing 5 men in a row, and that's not right. And so that comes from I think the better way to deal with it is by making sure that there are women at all levels of leadership, or at senior leadership positions in newsrooms. And we're creating a product here, a newspaper, a website. We can sort of do whatever we want in terms of creating what Politico Europe is. And I don't think I would ever do something that's just sort of solely targeted at women, because I think it should be fully integrated into how we do things here throughout, the way we cover the European Union, the way we cover the national governments, how we cover politics, that we need to be, that it just needs to be part of the report in general. So, but we also have a newsroom that's full of women, so we're also conscious of that as well. So I don't think that makes sense.
And you mentioned trying to make sure that you don't have a group of 5 profiles of men all at once. Do we have to understand that we're limited in how we can make equality of coverage when society in general is just unequal, when we know that most world leaders are men, that most CEOs are men, that most people who are going to be newsmakers are men? I mean, even on the negative side, most terrorists are men, so they're going to be reported on more. Do we have to accept that women's visibility will always kind of be limited in the media, and that we're limited in what we can do about it until society at large changes?
I mean, at Politico, we try to not go to the most, highlight the most obvious newsmakers and the most obvious people who are in power. We had our first sort of Politico 28 list, where we, similar to what Politico in the U.S. does, it's a Politico 50 list. You come up with 28 people. 28's based on the number of European Union nations, and I think we had almost parity, and that wasn't really. I mean, we were conscious of it, but the number 1 was Orban because of his newsmaking ability, and I think Vestager was number 2. She's the European Competition Commissioner, and the only reason we didn't put her at number 1 is because she felt obvious. But Orban, I felt, was a little more influential in terms of determining Europe's future. I think at number 3 we had Sturgeon, the SNP, leader, a woman, but even so, in highlighting sort of European EU leaders here in Brussels who matter, you don't have a woman leading the European Parliament or the Commission or the Council, and we should be asking that question as to why that isn't. Like I am all for sort of holding institutions accountable and doing a story that says, why the hell hasn't there been a woman leading any of these positions? And I'm all for things like that. But there are plenty of women who have key positions who are deciding policy in the European institutions, and it's our role as journalists to find out who they are, not because they're women, but because they actually are influential and they are making decisions. And we wrote a story about a woman who we called Juncker's brain, Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the president of the European Commission. The person who is determining his policy is a woman, and she's influential with him, and it was just so happened that she was a woman, but that's good, and it's our job to find that out, and be conscious of it as we decide what the news should be.
But I think that you're absolutely making the right point, and I don't entirely, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, Carrie. It's just that I'm not altogether sure that your position is a mainstream position. Mm-hmm. I think that you are very conscious, despite what you're saying, not going after women. I would suggest that if any other news organisation was asked to come up with the 50 top whatever, they would not have anywhere near parity between women and men. So I mean, I think that it's great that your organisation exists. It's great that you're there and that you've got a number of women. But I would suggest that is not typical. And I do think that it would be great if gender was mainstream. So we didn't even talk about gender. We never said a woman politician, a woman commissioner, a woman athlete, a woman anything, because we wouldn't need to, because we would never assume that an athlete or a politician or a terrorist would be female or male. But we don't yet live in that society. Mm-hmm. So for me, yes, I'd like women's voices in everything, women talking about every topic, women representing every topic, but we're not there yet. And while we're not there, while we're getting there, seems to me to have the women's page, women's sports, women's music, women's film. I don't see that's a problem, as long as it's not instead of the effort of mainstreaming gender or race or disability or anything else.
Yep. So another trend, maybe I'll just stick with Karen for the moment, because I think this trend is mostly coming out of the UK, but we've also seen it in the US, so I'll ask Elisa if you've noticed it. Databases of women experts. There's SheSource, I believe, in the UK, several other that I can't remember the name of at the moment, but initiatives to collect women experts on a variety of topics, from economics to the arts to history, and kind of put them forward to journalists, to moderators, to TV news producers, and say, you know, these are the women who are experts on this topic. Not to force anyone down their throat, but just you know, if media companies say, well, we had a economics panel and we had all 5 men because we couldn't find any female experts on economics, that these initiatives can kind of say, well, here they are on a silver platter. So, Karen, have you heard of these initiatives, and do you have any sense for if they're successful or if they've had an impact?
Okay, so the preeminent one in the UK is called the Women's Room.
Yes.
It was set up by Laura Bates, and any woman can, and including myself, can put our profile up there. That's great, and the BBC have run Expert Women Days for training women who are experts in their field to feel confident about going in front of a camera. And they've run a series of those days, again, very successful, massively, massively, massively oversubscribed. It's because what journalists will sometimes say is, oh, we tried to find a woman economist, we tried 5, and they all said no because they weren't confident about coming on. So in the end, we went for a guy. That's something which I've heard a gazillion times. So that's one thing. I think the expert databases are brilliant, but I mean, the Women's Room has been going for several years. It would be interesting to find out how many times any woman in that database, and there are thousands, have actually been contacted by a journalist because they have found her in that database. So it's great to have these initiatives, but actually, if journalists don't know about them, if somehow they know about them and they don't use them, because the process of 24/7 news is, right, I need to get a story out now, I'm just going to go to the person I normally go to. I'd love to be able to go to someone different, but I just don't have the time. So there's, you know, in many ways, what we're looking for, what we want to have that diversity of voice is often comes crunching up against a news deadline. And, you know, the newsroom process is actually militates in some ways against looking for those alternative voices, unless you're doing something longer, like a feature. So they're great, and we need to have more of them. And it's not just in the UK. I mean, the European Institute for Gender Equality, for example, have on their website, they have also a number of examples of other databases across Europe. So this is something, you know, I'm not so sure that it's a trend, but there are certainly those kind of expert women databases in countries other than the UK.
And Carrie, do you notice that in your newsroom, that just the process makes it difficult to get a diversity of opinion in terms of expert sources to interview?
Yeah, you know, that was something I was conscious of and probably guilty of myself, of not with the source base, unless they were in a position in the White House. But if you're just sort of doing a survey, a story where you have to call a bunch of political analysts, you know, I was conscious of the fact that, you know, often you would just be calling men because they were around or just sort of part of the stream of things, so they were easy to get a hold of. And so I was conscious of it, and sometimes guilty of not being as diverse as I could be in terms of the voices, and just like new voices. And women just aren't, there are not as many women who, if you look through the articles of sort of the top publications in Washington writing about politics, you would probably find a very, very small number of the, you know, commentators on politics being women. And here, you know, we don't like analyst quotes in general in stories. You know, you want to get primary sources, and I don't. So in this newsroom, I have not yet sort of even focused on that issue here. But I know in Washington, it's a problem, and there are so many men that are just sort of right on the other end of the line, willing to give a quote, and women are not as much. There's just not enough of those voices there, and you know, certainly on the cable shows, you can see in the U.S. you see a very conscious effort to have women on the panels, but in the written for print journalists, I don't really see it as much of a you know, a conscious effort being made by reporters, and I think that does change probably the conventional wisdom, you know, of how politics are perceived in Washington, or really anywhere. When you just have a bunch of men commenting on politics, that does change. That does give you a different lens on the news than if you call up 2 women, 3 women as part of your calls of 6 to 9 people to get, you know, a sense of what's happening. Having women in that mix provides a richer perspective, and you know, you have to do that, and I think we lose because we don't.
Yeah.
And so,
she sources actually from the Women's Media Center, which is New York based. But there are a couple of issues here. One is the audience and the audience demand. There are a few movements. I know in Germany, for example, there's a movement where men who are asked to join a panel, if they ask, are there women on the panel? Is there diversity on the panel? And if the answer is there are no women on the panel, they say no, thank you. Mm-hmm. So it is up to the consumer as well to decide what product they're willing to be a part of. I know, for example, there is a group coming up with an app or a web application to show the gender balance in every website that you're viewing. So if you go to the New York Times and there's only 10% women there, and then you go to Politico and there's 40%, then you as a consumer decide which media organization do I want to consume. Do I want to read a male-focused product, or do I want a product that is actually showing diversity? I think there is a lot to be said about the consumer being aware of what they're reading. In you know, the top 50 entrepreneurs lists that come out frequently, newsweek entrepreneurs, all men, all white. Well, we know that there are women out there. You just have to find them. A lot of it, I hate to say, is lazy journalism. But I think that as a consumer of the news, as a society, we need to say enough is enough. You know, there are a lot of comments on these lists that say, really, you couldn't find one woman. Honestly, how hard did you look? And I think that's kind of what we should ask journalists reporting on any issue. Really, how hard did you look? Because we know the women are there, and it would be a more interesting story, as Carrie was pointing out, if you actually had them represented.
So news consumers have more influence than they think. We can, it won't get read or it won't get watched unless there's a diversity of opinion. We have a few more minutes left. I hope that Shahida can come and join us again. I wanted to put one more question to her about reporting on women from conflict zones. But in the meantime, I wanted to just quickly talk about the issue of digital threats against women journalists, mostly because Dunja Mijatovic, the OSCE representative for freedom in the media, has been really outspoken about this issue lately, convening lots of conferences and panels to discuss what causes this and what can be done. As we see from our statistics from the Global Media Monitoring Project and other research, the discrepancy of women bylines, women authorship in traditional media, we see it also in digital media, in blogs and on websites. Is this due to the intimidation from the, I guess, increased amount or increased toxicity of threats against women online, often of a sexual nature? What's keeping women from publishing more online?
Who are you asking that to?
Karen, could you start?
I think you're right. What we saw in terms of digital media, and a number of the countries participating in GMMP 2015 looked at news sites, formal news blogs, and Twitter, and found that the kind of lack of visibility of women, both in terms of content and in production, more or less mirrored exactly what we saw in offline media, in legacy media. And on the one hand, I suppose we don't know why, but anecdotally, I mean, I think as Elisa has just mentioned, the UNESCO conference next month, I mean, there is a recognition that many women journalists are now coming out quite straightforwardly and talking about the abuse that they receive, particularly on Twitter. And not just women journalists, but women generally. You know, there have been any number, certainly in the UK and elsewhere, any number of media stories about women who even even mention equality, who just talk about the fact that, for example, there were no women on the currency in the UK, or that they're Gamergate, that women who are in the games industry, if they talk about the way in which women are represented in games, and there's been a whole kind of big discussion and a whole horrible Twitter storm around Gamergate. So it's not surprising, I think, that women either are reluctant to go online, or actually what is more likely happening is that they simply can conceal their identity. So actually, when we're looking at things around authorship online, I think that we actually have to be quite careful, because we don't actually know. I mean, the cloak of anonymity works both ways. It works both to protect women from the trolls, but it also means that we're not entirely sure, statistically, you know, how many women, how many men are out there blogging or being online. So I think that there's some issues there that we don't. I'm not sure how that we resolve them, but there is definitely a trend, a growing trend, that women journalists in the media more generally are vulnerable to really quite. It's not simply the kind of content of the tweets and the responses, but it's the volume. Because clearly there are concerted efforts, groups of people, presumably mostly men, who just get together and actually create a Twitter storm, actually just bombard women's pages with all sorts of horrible content.
Elisa, what do you think? Are there more steps we could take to make the internet a more welcoming place for women journalists?
Well, I think generally speaking, the law has to catch up with the technology here, and there are very few U.S. national laws. I know that there are more laws in Europe that protect journalists from this kind of trolling. But I want to go a step further, which is to say that, yes, trolling, I believe, and again, no real study has been done, does disproportionately affect women and is driving women out of the news media by huge numbers. But it is also used as a censorship mechanism by organized groups who are specifically trying to shut down the negative messages. So a lot more needs to be done in this arena. It really is keeping women off of the internet, and it's really dangerous to women and to men journalists as well.
Carrie, do you see that in your newsroom? Do you see women being discouraged by these threats, or?
No, I don't. but that doesn't mean anything. We don't, I don't read the comments. I never would read the comments on my stories when I wrote them.
That's one strategy.
Yeah, and that's good and bad. Sometimes people, it's good to read comments to sort of get that feedback, but it is so toxic that after, I just stopped doing it because of that. And certainly emails would come into me that would, be vile, and I just ignore it. It doesn't necessarily discourage me, but I'm not putting myself out there personally with very sort of personal content. I'm a reporter reporting on the news and other features, and so it was and same with reporters in this newsroom where we don't have personal blogs. We don't put out a lot of personal content from reporters. So I haven't seen it yet, though. I just know that I don't read the comments section because I'm aware of how unproductive it is often to do that, and I don't, that just sort of is not a space where I want to take myself ever, really, because it just doesn't really do much for me.
Just have nothing but kind of praise for the courage of many women journalists who tell their stories publicly and say, this happened to me, but you know what, I'm still doing it. They're not going to win. And those we need to kind of keep pushing back against the people who will try and silence it.
Mm-hmm. That's a really courageous and encouraging message. We're running out of time, but I'd like to invite last thoughts. What's a key marker of progress on women's participation and visibility in global media that everybody would really like to see in 2016, since we're at the beginning of the year? Elisa? Sorry. Elisa, would you like to start?
I think we all want to see more diversity at higher levels of news media. In my opinion, that would go a long way to resolving some of the issues that we encounter. Not all of them, but some of them. I think that women look up in their organizations, and if they don't see people that look like them at the higher levels, they decide that it's time to go elsewhere. Those are the kinds of comments that we receive. So I think more diversity at the top, and I just want to do another plug for consumerism. And we should be demanding diversity in our products, and I hope that more people do.
Karen?
I want to see what Elisa wants to see, but one of the things that I think is quite noticeable and would make a difference is for media organisations to implement the equality policies which they already have. I would like to see that, because a different study showed that media organisations have equality policies, they have gender diversity policies, but they have no way of monitoring them. They have no real way of implementing them. So rather, we don't, like Elisa was saying, we have the legislation. It's just not imposed. It's not implemented, and there seems to be so little comeback, so the penalty for non-compliance with either formal legislation or internal policies. I would like to see that addressed by media organisations themselves.
Thank you. And we have Shahida back with us now, and we're just doing final thoughts actually right now, but there was one particular question I wanted to ask of Shahida because of your wealth of experience reporting in conflict zones as well as culturally conservative societies. What do journalists need to do? How can journalists improve the way that they tell women's stories in these societies where they're kind of kept in the background?
Oh, it all depends case by case. I don't know. I normally listen and assess the situation and then go ahead. It's all instinct-based in my case, and that's what I teach my reporters. Of course, you have to be culturally aware of certain things you cannot do. For example, if you interview a Syrian refugee family and there is a man and there is a woman, of course you need to talk to the man first. But then a woman is what gives you a better picture and better story. But I have to respect the guy, so that works, and it's normally the case. I don't know. It's to be perfectly honest, there's no recipe, but there's certain rules like everyone else knows. It's just just assess by instinct.
Carrie, what would you like to see as a key marker for improvement in women's visibility in the media this year?
I mean, I could, I have the good fortune of being able to implement some of that here. I see this is a newsroom that I'm helping manage, and my success this year would be to sort of challenge, perceptions about women in how we're reporting the news, and make sure I'm conscious of that, and just supporting, women in their development as political reporters, which is a challenging profession. I was lucky enough to have a woman when I was in my young 20s who said, "Oh, you're a woman, you like politics, I'm going to make you a political reporter," and that's like literally how I got into this. So if I could pass that on, that's a good thing, and just sort of, again, challenging perceptions, conventional wisdom about women, being conscious of that every day, and then just supporting women. So I have the luxury of being able to do some of that here, and I'll probably leave it at that.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We have Shahida Tulaganova, Managing Editor of Current Time TV, here with me in Prague. In Washington, D.C., we have Elisa Munoz. She's the Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation. In Brussels, we have Carrie Brown. She's the Managing Editor of Politico, overseeing its European newsroom. And in the UK, Professor Karen Ross, Professor of Media at Northumbria University. I'm Emily Thompson from RFERL, the Lady Liberty page. And thank you for watching RFERL Live.
Thank you so